Thank you. It's a very impressive sound system. Delighted to see you all today, and I want to compliment Christ Nagar alumni for having worked with the institution to create the CANexXT program. The name is interesting. It has a lot of useful elements in it. Christ Nagar is there, alumni is there, networking is there. The word for action, can, is there right at the very beginning. And the word for extension, extending yourself to others, is there at the end. Next. And at the same time, the idea of the next thing that you will all be doing is in CANexXT. So first class thinking for whoever came up with this name and with this program. Congratulations to all of you. Now, I've just been told that the idea is that you're going to launch a series of talks. Talks about ideas or events or stories that have changed your life and perhaps can change the lives of others who are listening. And my problem is I've done a lot of things in life that have been life-changing for me and for others, and I wouldn't know where to begin. But I thought that I would give you a short glimpse into a change that came across me as a fairly young man. I joined the United Nations at the rather precocious age of 22. I had just finished my PhD. In fact, I defended it on a Friday in Boston, arrived in Geneva on a Saturday. I beg your pardon, arrived in Geneva, yes, that's right, on Saturday, had Sunday to recover, and Monday I started work. Monday, the 1st of May, 1978. And on that occasion, I still recall not quite being fully sure what I'd got into. I had thought of the United Nations as a place for international diplomacy, where governments got together, discussed issues, dealt with the big newspaper headline problems of the world. But that United Nations at that time was closed to Indian citizens. They had a national quota. Indians were considered overrepresented. And so there was no possibility of applying for any jobs in, if you like, at that point, the political United Nations. Instead, I joined a humanitarian part of the organization, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which at that point was a rather small, not terribly well-known body in Geneva, Switzerland, with some branches and some humanitarian operations around the world, but not terribly many. And you know, it's interesting because many people said to me, you'll have a good time, you'll sit in Europe and discover a different part of the world and make a good UN salary. No one seemed to spend much time thinking about what the work of the organization was all about. But when I got there and I realized that refugee crises were about human beings caught up in the greatest torment of their lives, I began to realize that it was in many ways far, far more meaningful and profound than the kind of desk job I'd initially assumed that the United Nations entailed. First of all, a refugee is somebody who has given up everything and fled their country. Somebody who has left their homes, their assumptions, their friendship, the climate they know, the food they're used to, the language they speak, to flee their country into some other strange country. It takes a lot of desperation to have to do that. And at the same time, they may not be welcome in the new country. They don't know what future awaits them. They have to reinvent their lives and themselves. And that an organization existed in the United Nations to protect and assist these people was, for me, a very interesting revelation. It didn't take very long after I joined for the relatively small, modest, and unknown nature of the organization to transform itself dramatically. When I joined UNHCR, as it was called, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, I still remember, 1st of May 1978, there was a conference of UN representatives to meet the new High Commissioner for Refugees, the former Prime Minister of Denmark, Paul Hartling. And on that occasion, as the representatives gathered around the table, many were saying things like how good it was to be part of a small organization where everyone knew each other by their first names, where we worked quietly and unobtrusively behind the scenes in order to press governments to protect people who had lost all their rights, namely refugees. Yet, within months of my joining the organization was transformed. The Vietnamese refugee crisis began as Vietnamese started fleeing communist tyranny in small boats coming out to the South China Sea and in many cases making it to the shores of neighboring Southeast Asian countries. We had eruptions in the Horn of Africa with civil wars in Ethiopia, conflict in Somalia, coupled with famine. So again, millions of people being displaced. The following year, we had the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union that led to large numbers of Afghan refugees fleeing into Pakistan and Iran. You had a revolution in Nicaragua and Central America and people fleeing there. And suddenly, having joined a small and anonymous organization, I found that I was working for an organization that was a lead story in the BBC World News. Not just once, but the top 5 stories in the world would have involved UNHCR at that time, because all these major crises were generating the human flotsam and jetsam that had become refugee problems. So while I was there, the organization quadrupled in size, quintupled in budget, became a huge, huge institution, extremely well known around the world, which it wasn't when I joined it. And I had the rare privilege as a relatively young man of exercising responsibilities completely out of proportion to my age and experience very quickly. Because having joined, I was in an inside position to take these responsibilities. And after 3 years at headquarters, I asked for and was selected for a job heading the Singapore office of UNHCR, which was the center of our efforts to deal with the refugees rescued at sea. Now, why were they rescued at sea? Because they would come out onto the South China Sea, aiming for the shores of neighboring countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and sometimes really farther away, the Philippines. But sometimes they wouldn't make it, either because they didn't have the navigation skills, or their boats weren't good enough, or their engines broke down, whatever it may be. And when they were at sea, literally, and drifting or otherwise unable to go somewhere, ships would pick them up, would rescue them. There is a famous code that all sailors and all maritime people know, which is that you must always save the lives of people who are in distress at sea. Now, when these ships picked up the refugees, usually they were on their way to Singapore, which is the biggest port in the region. And so these refugees would arrive, and the UN office there had to disembark them, look after them in a refugee camp, and ideally resettle them outside in other countries, because Singapore didn't want to keep them. Now, this arrangement had not been working terribly well. And when I arrived in Singapore, there was a lot of open hostility on the part of the Singapore government, partly provoked by the fact that the numbers of refugees were far more than they had expected or wanted to cope with. We had, for example, about 4,000 or even 5,000 people in what had earlier been a camp for British Army officers in the Second World War, and that was meant to accommodate 25 people. So instead of a family per house, there were sometimes 50 families per house. There were 20 sleeping on the living room floor, and I even found some people arranging a couple of planks on a tree and lying down to sleep on a tree bark. That was how difficult conditions were. So I had to come in and deal with that. And you could well ask, isn't the United Nations the wrong organization to do this kind of work? Are you not merely bureaucratizing your conscience by asking a UN body to do it? Shouldn't a charitable organization do it? Or a church group do it? That's what charities normally come to mind, would be NGOs and churches and other humanitarian organizations. But the big advantage that the UN had when it came to refugees is that precisely because we are an intergovernmental organization, and we had therefore the clout that came from a mandate given to us by the General Assembly, which applied even in countries that had not signed the UN Convention on Refugees or its protocol on refugees. Because of that, we had the authority to speak to government officials and say, you can't do this, or we request you to do that, or we seek permission for this. And things that a church group might not be able to accomplish, a UN official could, if he used his skills sufficiently well to be able to be both persuasive, diplomatic, and at the same time firm. As you can imagine, this was an incredibly educative experience for me. For the next 3.5 years, I led this office. I was able to persuade a number of Western countries to actually accept refugees for repatriation, not repatriation, the correct word is resettlement. Resettlement to their countries, even if it wasn't nationalities of their ships that rescued them. See, earlier the plan was, whichever country's ship, every ship flies a flag, rescues refugees, that country is responsible for taking the people. But sometimes there were countries like India and Bangladesh, which were not considered viable homes for refugees from Vietnam. There were very often countries flying flags of convenience, like Panama and Liberia. Many shipping companies, for tax reasons and other benefits, tend to actually be owned by a company somewhere else, but to fly the flag of a state like Panama or Liberia, which gives them this privilege. So that became the other complication. Panama and Liberia weren't going to take a lot of Vietnamese refugees, nor did they want to go there. So I had to persuade a number of Western countries to pool their resources and agree that they will take these people. Otherwise, Singapore was threatening to shut down the disembarkations and not allow people to disembark in their country at all, because Singapore said, we are being stuck with these population we don't want. I remember when I first went to call on the foreign minister, a senior Singapore official who later became a good friend, said to me, you know, our prime minister has said, we must grow calluses on our heart or we will bleed to death. That was the kind of mood that confronted me when I got there. So the first challenge was to deal with the problems, understand that governments have a responsibility to their own citizens, therefore try and solve the problems so that they have an incentive to cooperate. At the same time, use slightly tough language based on the UN authority that I had, the statute of the organization, so that particularly in every country, the Home Ministry is toughest when it comes to foreigners. Dealing with the senior officials of the Home Ministry was always a greater challenge than dealing with the diplomats of the Foreign Ministry. But I had to do both. And then actually running the camp itself, because in other countries in Southeast Asia, the governments or even the military would often run the refugee camps. But in Singapore, they wanted nothing to do with refugees. So they said, the UN, if you want to disembark these people, you look after them. And in those days, UNHCR had this myth that it was non-operational. So the instruction from Geneva was, you cannot run a camp, you cannot be operational. Your job is to protect refugees and deliver assistance, but you find an operational partner. So I was stuck. Where do I find an operational partner to take on this burden? Then since I'm at Christ Nagar, let me say my Jesuit education came to my rescue. I had been to 2 Jesuit schools in India, Camp in Bombay and St. Xavier's, Calcutta. And I remembered how much the fathers used to care for the unfortunates of the world. One of my favorite professors of English was a Jesuit father who would spend all his spare time visiting and ministering to prisoners in jails, often those who had been convicted to life imprisonment and worse. And that was always there. So I went to a couple of Catholic fathers in one of the big schools and said, "This is my problem. Can you agree to being the face for my headquarters by sponsoring one person who will officially be your employee, but who will be actually running the camp under my guidance and supervision? You will have no headaches, I'll do everything, but for the sake of my headquarters, I will say you are handling the operation, you're my operational partner." And I still remember Father Reed saying, "Yes, okay, we'll do that for you." And I've always been very grateful to the Jesuits since they managed to give me Christian Relief Services or some made-up name like that was my official operational partner. And they would pay the salary for a young man, usually a young man, to come spend anything from a year to two in the refugee camp and being the administrator. And I, being a good Indian Democrat, I got the Vietnamese refugees to elect their own leaders. So they administered themselves in many, many ways until they got resettled and moved on. Now, I talked about bureaucratizing the conscience. Let me tell you why it wasn't so bureaucratic. There's so many stories I could tell you, but the time is limited. I'll just tell you one. A young family had left Vietnam on a small boat. They cannibalized a tractor engine to power their boat. They went to sea. Inevitably, this engine, which was not meant to power a boat, conked out. They started drifting because they had no power anymore. It was raining, the weather was bad. They ran out of drinking water. They ran out of food. And they were still drifting aimlessly in the South China Sea, surviving on just rainwater and hope. That's okay for the parents, but they had two small infants with them. A tiny baby, just a few months old, and then a toddler, less than 2 years, a year and a half old. So what could they do? Those babies can't live on water, rainwater and hope. So the parents slit their fingers and made the infants suck their blood in order to get some nourishment to stay alive. The story had a happy ending. They were rescued, but when they were rescued, they were so weak, so enfeebled by this experience that they couldn't even stand up in their boats. They had to be physically, bodily lifted by rescuers and carried onto an American ship. When that ship docked in port, my staff and I broke every rule in the book to rush this family to intensive care in the General Hospital in Singapore. But to see that same family a few months later, healthy, well-fed, well-dressed, and literally about to take off for new lives, in their case, the US, that offered the kind of satisfaction that no bureaucratic job in the world or in the United Nations could have offered. It was the satisfaction of knowing that things you were doing were actually helping real human beings and people you could see, not just people whose names were numbers on a document. And what happened to me was that in doing this kind of work day after day after day, I was able to put my head to the pillow at night knowing that things I had done during the day had made a real difference to human beings' lives. And this has been thereafter my motivation throughout whatever I've done. I have sought to be involved, to involve myself, both at the United Nations and subsequent. I left refugees after 11 years, went and worked in the peacekeeping department, did the political work required, worked in the Secretary General's office, finally headed my own department, became a UN administrator and manager. But throughout, the motivation was very clear. I want to make a difference to people's lives for my having been here in this job at this time on this planet. And as a result, when I came into politics, I didn't have to look very far for motivation. I still remember my first campaign in 2009, which was much tougher and more arduous than I had ever imagined. Not just 18-hour days, there were days of 22, 23 hours on the campaign trail. In those days, people were much less strict about enforcing the time limits. And after mics had to be switched off at 10, we would often go on till 2 a.m. campaigning. And there were still people waiting outside their homes. But in this exhausting, completely unfamiliar situation that I, as a UN official, was not prepared for, I still remember a moment when I was perhaps feeling some uncertainty and doubt about what I was doing here. When I was on my campaign vehicle, my converted Jeep, waving at crowds, and at one point we stopped at a traffic light. And there on the sidewalk, I still remember him so vividly, was a very poor laborer. His body was bare and blackened by the sun. He had just a very small munda, a waistcloth, not even all the way down to his feet, just tied in a pimburi around his waist. He had something, a little cloth on his head and a basket of something he was carrying. He was obviously too poor to afford even a shirt or a pair of slippers. But this man spotted me and he stopped with this basket and he turned to me full face and smiled. Brilliant white teeth in his dark face, a smile of hope, a smile of expectation, a smile of trust. And that's when I realized, yes, politics is not just about politicking. It's not just about speeches in parliament or on the campaign trail. It is not just an issue of policies that are written about in books and articles. It is ultimately, like everything that matters in life, an issue of people. And that's why, inspired by that experience in Singapore 38 years ago now, I'm still in politics on my 11th year after joining it, proud to represent all of you, the people of Thiruvananthapuram, and proud to be on the stage in CANexXT before you all. Great pleasure with these words. I officially inaugurate your CANexXT program project. All the best. Jai Hind.
What is the future of refugee rehabilitation, considering the biggest displacement of refugees, increasing hostility
within many countries around the world, I'm assuming. Yeah, I mean, there is a genuine increase in problems of refugees around the world. And in the UN, we had a simple catechism. There were 3 solutions to the refugee crisis. The best was what we call voluntary repatriation. Repatriation means going back home to the country they have fled. But it has to be voluntary. If you force people back to a country where they have been persecuted and they fear persecution, that would be an act of unhumanitarian cruelty, and the UN does not support that. Sadly, some countries are trying to push refugees back to their home countries. Right now we have the crisis of the Rohingya in our country, which the government of India wants to push back to Burma, to Myanmar. And they are afraid to go back, and they say our villages were burned, our women were raped, our homes were destroyed. We have no rights there, we don't want to go back. And in that situation, it becomes very difficult to push people back. So voluntary repatriation is the best solution. The second best is what we call local integration. That works very well in Africa in many cases. When refugees cross a border but stay close to that border, often in areas of similar climate, similar topography, similar lifestyles, and sometimes even similar languages, because in Africa, many of the countries, the borders have been drawn by colonial masters ignoring the actual demographic realities of these countries. And in that particular instance, local integration becomes feasible because you just go and integrate with the neighboring country and they allow you to settle down and that becomes your permanent home. The third most difficult and most expensive solution is refugee resettlement, where you actually transport people sometimes half a world away to make new lives in a totally new country. And those are usually countries which have a certain, how shall I put it, they're developed countries, they're rich countries, they have a humanitarian tradition, they believe that it's part of their identity, they must give a home to refugees. And countries in the Western world, and particularly Western Europe and America, Canada, have had reputation for doing this. But it's also a challenge. It's a challenge for the refugees themselves to completely reinvent their lives. And it's a challenge very often for the host countries to absorb people of different color of skin, different religious practices, different cultures, different eating habits, and so on. Not every country is able to assimilate foreigners that easily, and then tensions have arisen. So what is the long-term prospect? At the moment, it doesn't look very good. Because whereas in my days at the UN, no country would refuse to take refugees if you ask nicely enough and you also solve the problem for them. But today, more and more countries are imposing artificial barriers at their borders, saying refugees can't come. Go back and face the persecution, go back and face the bombs, you're not our problem, they say. In some cases, countries are only imposing very small quotas and taking just people whom they believe will assimilate easily into their societies, usually people who know their language or of some education levels and some prospects. And as a result, we find some real challenges in persuading countries to take refugees. India used to have a great tradition. India, going back several thousand years, when the Jews fled persecution by the Babylonians after destruction of their first temple, or by the Romans after destruction of their second temple, they came to Kerala. No one stopped them. In fact, they were given land, they were given the right to live and practice their own faith. That was the Indian tradition. The same later, when St. Thomas of the Bible, Doubting Thomas, landed on the shores of Kerala. The story is that he was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. The same happened to the Parsis when they came to Gujarat. There's an absolutely wonderful story of the Parsi fleet coming to the shores of Gujarat, and the king sends an envoy to them saying, there is no room for you. Of course, they had no language in common. So the king asked the envoy to explain as graphically as he could that these people could not disembark in his territory because there was no space for them, there were too many people. So the envoy called for a glass of water, a tumbler of water, and he dropped a stone and the water spilled over. That was a way of showing the Parsis, sorry, no space. If you come here, the water will spill over. But the Parsi captain, the leader of the Parsi fleet, was a very wise man. He told the envoy, wait. He called for a tumbler of milk, and in that milk, he carefully stirred a spoonful of sugar. And the message he was giving is, we will only sweeten your life here. We will not be like the stone that makes you overflow. The envoy was so impressed with this that he went back to the king and conveyed the story. And the king said, okay, let them come. These are good people. Gave them the lands. And that's why to this day in India, the Gujarati is the language of the Parsi people. They don't speak Farsi, they speak Gujarati because that's where they first got refuge when they came to India in the 7th century, fleeing persecution in their home country of Iran. That's the interesting thing about this story. There are many, many more stories one could tell, but that was the tradition of our culture. Swami Vivekananda, in his famous speech to Chicago, talked about the fact that he stood on behalf of a country that had offered refuge to the persecuted of all races and religions. Thank you. That was the great strength of Indian culture. Today, this same country is behaving in a much more petty, narrow-minded, even xenophobic manner. We have not given refugees to the Rohingya. We've said they should be deported. Increasingly individual. Today, I tweeted the story, not of a refugee, but the principle is the same. A Spanish nun, 86 years old, who has been living in India for more than 50 years, since 1959, 60 years almost, and who has been expelled from India. They refuse to renew her visa, saying, we don't want you here as a foreigner. What harm can an 86-year-old woman who has spent her life in charitable work do to India? This is not our culture, but this is now the mentality that is taking over our country. So I'm sorry to say the prognosis can't look very good. I just hope that we can again speak for decency and truth and compassion in the years ahead and change the present phase of negativism, pettiness, and xenophobia that the world seems to be going through.
Thank you, sir. Next question is from Steve Sergeant Jacob of Standard 10. Christ Nagar ICSE School. As you have been globally acknowledged as a man of vocabulary, I would like you to give me and the crowd a new word for us to learn to make this auspicious event more memorable.
I'll give you a very simple, very old word. Read. That's the only way I acquired a vocabulary. People think that I'm some sort of nutcase who studies dictionaries all day long. I have barely opened a dictionary in my life, but I have read extensively. And if you read widely, you read extensively, and you come across the same word in 3 different contexts in 3 different books, you'll understand the meaning and the usage very quickly. So the reason I was like that is, of course, I had some advantages over all of you. I lived in an India without television, without computers, without Nintendo, without PlayStation, without mobile phones. And I was an asthmatic child, so I was very often confined to bed, unable to breathe. All I had were books. Books were my escape, books were my education. And because I read, and I read above my age level, and I read anything I could get my hands on, I developed the kind of mind that God has now blessed me with, and I acquired the vocabulary that comes with it. So my only advice to all of you is read, read, read. The more you read, the better your vocabulary will also be. Thanks.
One of the biggest crises Kerala is facing is the devastating floods occurring every year. Your thought on managing this?
Well, you know, when we had the floods last year, which were unprecedented, we had never seen anything as bad as that since 1926. On that occasion, I took the opportunity when Thiruvananthapuram itself, which was amongst the least affected districts, when our camps, which I visited in the first 2 or 3 days of the floods, when they started closing and people were able to go home, I took the opportunity to go and visit the United Nations office in Geneva and speak to all the UN humanitarian agencies, the World Health Organization, and the International Committee of the Red Cross to get some guidance on what should be done. And then I came back and briefed the Chief Minister, Shri Pinarayi Vijayan, on what I had learned. I think that thereafter what the state has been doing, at least in principle, is already the right thing. What the UN suggested was a multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary damage assessment. And I said to the Chief Minister, don't do it through your bureaucrats, because immediately others will say your numbers are not credible. Get the UN agencies, the World Bank and so on involved, and they will send experts from all the different sectors to do a thorough job and come up with a serious assessment that no one can challenge. The Chief Minister did exactly that, as you all know, and we now have a very serious inter-agency damage assessment report of the UN system, which says we've suffered 31,000 crores of damage. But the challenge then comes, how do we rebuild? Rebuilding requires 3 things. It requires money, it requires expertise, and it requires political will to do it. And it's not easy. Money to begin with has been scarce. The central government has behaved quite shamefully in how little money they've given Kerala and how much they have blocked Kerala from getting funding of its own from friendly countries. Secondly, the expertise is partly available here, partly not available here. Assembling a team is expensive because it costs fees, salaries, consultancies. And then the political will is a tough one. Political will becomes indispensable because the only future for Kerala to avoid repeated tragedies like this will involve some very tough decisions. As you know, from 1926 to 2018, there was nothing like the floods we had. But from 2018 to 2019, in less than 1 year, we had another set of rains, floods, and landslides. Last year, we lost 438 people. This year, we lost 105 people. So everyone says this year was not as bad as last year. But for those 105 and their families and their homes, it was as bad as can humanly get. So the point that comes then is, What do you do that next year we don't again have a repeat with 50 or 60 or 70 people somewhere else dying? The only answer has got to be we have to do some very serious work, including using international expertise. We have to do some what's called floodplain mapping to figure out geologically what are the natural flows of the water in the case of intense rain. We have to figure out where the land is unstable and landslides may occur. And we have to take the tough political call of saying to people, we know you have lived here all your life, we know your grandparents are buried here, but you have to move because tomorrow your place may be buried under a collapsing hill and the state government cannot save you. So why don't you do this? We'll either give you compensation or we'll give you land equivalent to this somewhere else, but you have to move. Now, that seems very simple in theory. In practice, it's very difficult. Human beings, particularly Malayalis, are attached to their land. And then you have the emotional, ancestral, and other connections to a place, which makes it very difficult for people to move. There's always this, when disasters happen, many people tend to think, well, that didn't happen to me. Poor, unfortunate people there, but it didn't happen to me, it won't happen to me. But don't forget, those who were hurt this year are not in the same areas as those who were hurt last year. So already we're seeing that Kerala is being affected in all sorts of ways. Yet, what about planning permission for construction? We still give it without looking at the long-term consequences. We have been intruding upon our water bodies, upon riverbeds. We have been disturbing the fragile ecology of the Western Ghats. And when, for example, the Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee President Mullapalli Ramachandran said that we must rethink our opposition to the Gadgil report and the Kasturirangan report, saying that we must therefore look again at putting nature first rather than human settlements. The reaction that has come from the ruling party is, no, we have to put human beings first. Their interests are what matter. And you can't blame the ruling party because ultimately that's what democratic politics is all about. People have votes. Geological experts from abroad don't have votes. People can make or break your government. A hill may or may not break your government, but it's not going to decisively affect the next election. So for all of these reasons, summoning up the political will becomes a problem. And in any democracy, we have the additional problem that no politician can afford to think beyond the next election. So we all have a short-term horizon. We think up to the next election. So a long-term kind of plan where you rebuild Kerala over 20 years, any chief minister, any other minister is going to say, I'm not going to be here in 20 years. It'll be somebody else's problem. And that's not just for rebuilding Kerala, it's for most kinds of decisions. That today you and I can sit here in an educational institution and say how very short-sighted that is. But in practice, that's the real world in which politicians live and work and within which framework they have to think. It is said that politicians think of the next election, statesmen think of the next generation. We have far too few statesmen in our politics anywhere in Kerala or in the democracies around the world. So we have to accept that there is a big challenge. Until we overcome all of that, my fear is we may be doomed to ever-recurring tragedies, and increasingly people's sympathy will go down. Already this year's support, sympathy, funding has been less than last year. If it keeps happening every year, people are just going to assume this is routine to Kerala. Why can't they do something more to prevent it themselves? So we have to take our own security in our own hands and act with political will and determination, use the resources that were collected last year effectively to provide relief to people, give them compensation to move, but rebuild Kerala in such a way that we will not be so vulnerable the next time around. Okay, are we done?
Youth in India has many dreams, but a very few succeed in achieving them. Your opinion about them?
Many dreams, you said?
Yes, very many dreams.
But that's true of youth anywhere. I mean, we all have dreams, and particularly when we are young, it's not a bad time to dream because life ahead seems to be full of infinite possibilities. And one of the sad things about getting older and older is as you get older, your possibilities narrow. The options before you get fewer. In your 20s, you can dream of becoming a movie star. In your 50s, you may have to give up that idea. In your 20s, you can be aiming to be a pilot or an explorer or something truly adventurous. By the time you're in your 40s or 50s, you can no longer do that. So in many ways, the passage of time also marks the narrowing of possibility. So when you say that young people have dreams but they can't fulfill them, that's a predicament facing everybody in the world. And it happens to everybody because when we are young, as I say, everything seems open and possible, but then we develop responsibilities, there are family expectations, there are social expectations, we acquire a family, there are children we have to bring up, all these sorts of things, and then job security, a salary, etc. become more important than taking an adventurous decision, starting a leap. That's very true in our culture particularly. It's interesting that now entrepreneurship has become respectable, because certainly when I was growing up, the ultimate aspiration for any middle-class family in this country was a government job. The assumption was a government job, you get a good salary, all the perks and benefits, no one can fire you, and you retire with a pension. That's what you should be, your ambition in life. Fortunately, we have moved from that thinking. There's much more willingness to take risks, much more willingness to support entrepreneurship, even in Kerala. So I would say to all of the young people here, when you're young is a good time to pursue your dreams. Take risks, start your own ventures, your own businesses, do things that you were not sure you could do. Because there's no shame in failing. Nobody in this world has achieved success without failure on the way. So what you have to do is tell yourself, if I fail, I'll bounce back. And if it turns out that what I'm doing is not something that either me or the society are adequately equipped to do, then I will have to move on and do something else. And then the compromises may come later in life and all the other obligations. But don't start off as a young person working towards a goal of compromising and ever coming up to a conclusion like that. Best thing to do is to actually, and I say this to you with utter sincerity, don't let yourself down. Be the best that you can be. Every one of you has some talent, some dream, some aspiration. You should have the self-awareness to know what your own strengths are, your own weaknesses are. You should challenge yourself to make the most of your strengths, to be the best version of you that you can possibly be. Don't forget, nobody else can be you. In our school system, we often think all our life is about competing with the other student. Not important. What's really important is to compete with yourself. There is no shame in coming last in the 100-meter dash if God has not equipped you with the leg muscles and the stamina to beat that other boy. There's no point feeling bad about it. But you've tried and you've failed. Not everybody is going to come first in class. But you've tried, you know what you can accomplish, you've done the best you can do. Ultimately, if you are the best that you can be, if you do the best that you can do, no one can demand more of you. The most important thing I'll say to any young person is, don't let yourself down. Be you, be the best version of yourself, do the best you can, and if it doesn't help you fulfill your dreams, it doesn't matter. Very much the pleasure of seeking to fulfill the dream is actually as important as fulfilling it in many, many cases in real life. So good luck to all of you. May you all find success and may you fulfill some of your dreams always. Jai Hind.
Thank you.